Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Sporting Fan Podcast. Today on the podcast, I'll be speaking about a couple of things that are happening around Super Rugby. The first is obviously a summary of the final that happened last weekend, as well as the season itself. And the second thing will be reporting that that there's going to be an end of Super Rugby at the end of the current deal, which expires at the end of next year. I'll quickly go through the season, then I'll speak about the final. The season itself had a few interesting results. The Australian teams weren't expected to win many, if any, games at all against New Zealand sides. I said on the podcast just before the Trans-Tasman games that I couldn't see any Australian victories, but there have been some good results for them. The Brumbies won 3 games against New Zealand sides, and the Waratahs beat the Crusaders. The Rebels also had a win over the Highlanders, so there were several positives for the Australian teams, namely that this was the first year in a long time that they had some strong results, and they were actually competitive in a lot of games. However, when it came to the finals, the New Zealand sides had all 5 teams make the finals, and the Australian teams only had 3 teams make it through, and only one Australian team made the semis. Some teams did a lot better than I expected. Obviously, the Waratahs did much better than they did last year. They beat the Crusaders, which I mentioned, which I think no one saw coming, and they made it through the quarterfinals, which is a much better result than they had last year, where they didn't win a single game against anyone, whether it be the Australian teams or the New Zealand teams. They didn't win a game, so much improved on their part, and they should be very happy with their results. With that kind of improvement. The Brumbies had 3 games. They won 3 games against the New Zealand sides this year, which shows improvement on their part as well. From last year, where they only beat the Hurricanes due to a missed penalty goal from Geordie Barrett, and they very nearly beat the Blues in Park in the semi-final, where they were over the ball and very nearly got a penalty, which, if the conversion went over, they actually would have won the game. They ended up losing by a point. So this shows that that they have improved quite a bit from last year to this year. The other 3 Australian teams, however, to put it bluntly, were pathetic against New Zealand sides. Yes, the Rebels beat the Highlanders in the final game of the regular season, and there were some competitive matches, but on the most part, their attack looked lost. The other 3 their attack looked lost and stagnant at times, and they really lacked direction. The rest were the worst. As the Force and Rebels aren't as strong of size as the Reds, but the Reds really should have been better than what they were, the Reds. The Reds looked lost at several points this year throughout the season, and it was clear that once Plan A didn't work, they didn't really know what to do. They didn't really have a Plan B. It's been found out that the whole game plan centers around the scrum and line-out, and the scrum was okay, and it looks good against the other Australian sides because the Australian sides, their scrum isn't as strong, but against New Zealand sides, at best, they could only really hold their own. They would never really had a dominant scrum, and the New Zealand teams clearly knew that. They obviously had seen the tape, and they shut them down fairly easily, and this was the same in the lineouts. The lineout drive, which they're relying on, was really shut down this year, and they just didn't know where to go once that was shut down. They looked completely lost. The Rebels and Force, their problem is that they struggle to get quality players to go there simply because of where they're based. Most of the quality players come out of the ACT, New South Wales or Queensland, and many players don't want to move to Melbourne, let alone Perth, and the local competitions aren't strong enough to bring up enough quality players. Obviously, some have had gone to those teams and they've improved which has made their side slightly stronger, but they're never really going to be the best teams regularly. They might get the odd win here and there, but they're not. I can't see them in either the long or the short term winning regular games unless they really develop their own juniors. The two Pacific teams struggled a bit, like any new team into an established competition. The first year, probably 2 or 3 years, are usually fairly difficult because you're trying to establish combinations and that. But both the Jura and Moana Pacifica had good wins this year. Both won 2 games. So there are definitely things that they can take away as positives this year. Obviously, Moana had a rough time of it this year with both teams, with both them and often teams that they were playing against getting struck down with COVID. So often they were playing multiple games in a week. They were often playing on a Tuesday or a Wednesday to make up, and then they were playing again on the Friday or Saturday. Hopefully this doesn't happen again next year, so we get to see their full potential, and fingers crossed they get a few more wins under their belt. As for the New Zealand sides, as I said, all teams made the finals, and only the Hurricanes lost to an Australian team in the quarterfinals. They lost to the Brumbies, while the Highlanders got knocked out. They also got knocked out in the quarterfinals against the Blues. The teams that didn't make the grand final, so the Chiefs, the Hurricanes, and Highlanders, they've really had mixed results this year. The Chiefs beat the Crusaders this year, where they scored a couple of tries late to win that game, and that was an incredible comeback. That game, that was a great game. But they also had a loss to the Brumbies, and they nearly lost to a pretty average Rebels team. The Hurricanes were in the same boat. They beat the Blues, and they were the only team to beat the Blues throughout the regular season this year. But then they lost to the Brumbies twice this year, as well as losing to the Force, which I forgot to mention earlier, who weren't much better than the Rebels, and they also lost to the Moana Pacifica. Really, both teams really had a roller coaster of a season. So they had some really good results, but they then also had some pretty average results. As for the Highlanders, they had a season that they would rather forget. They only got to the finals because of a bonus point loss in the final game of the year against the Rebels, a game that they really should have won, and then they got knocked out in the first week of the finals to the Blues. I don't believe they beat a New Zealand side all year, so they have a lot to build on. They were close in a lot of games, but it's just their match awareness, the ability to get over the line, really let them down this year. Now to the teams that were in the final. The Blues and Crusaders finished 1 and 2 on the ladder, and it wasn't a fluke. Both teams played the best style of footy all year. As mentioned, they didn't have. Both teams had upset losses this year, which were a shock. The Blues to the Hurricanes, and then you had the like I mentioned, the Crusaders had losses to the Chiefs and the Waratahs. But other than that, they always looked in control. Even when games got close, you always saw that they would find something to get themselves over the line and win that game. The only other loss that the Crusaders had all year was to the Blues. And this was the first time the Blues had beaten the Crusaders since 2014. And it was actually the first time they won in Christchurch since 2004. So they've really improved in the last few years under Liam McDonald. And, this is the first time the Blues have really had a championship quality team in a long time. And, this squad is really competitive, and they have a chance to win the competition next year. Both teams make up the majority of the All Black squad as well, so that really shows the dominance of both teams throughout the year, because they've been rewarded with the All Black selection. Now to the final itself. The Crusaders were the dominant team. Both teams were near full strength, with the main out being Ethan Blackadder for the Crusaders with a dislocated shoulder, which he needed surgery on, and he will be out for the rest of the year. It was a quality match. The best two teams were in it, and they both deserved to be in the final. There wasn't a dark horse that had an upset in the finals, and both teams, like I said, would play some terrific football this year. The Crusaders were the better team in the final, and they ended up getting up 21-7. They seemed to be in control for most of the game, and it quite easily could have been. They could have quite easily won by more. The Crusaders were held up over the line a couple of times. Another couple of times they were pushed out, or the Blues got a turnover. And so, but yeah, I think the Crusaders experienced some big games. They've been in the final basically they have been in the final every year since 2017. So that big game experience really came through, and they really dominated the game. Personally, I thought the Blues had a big chance of winning this game, and I thought they, being at Eden Park, and they've been so dominant throughout the year with only losing that one game. I thought they could, that would get them over the line, especially with the game being at Eden Park. The gambling companies also backed this up. They had the Blues as slight favourites to win, but as I said, the big game experience came through for the Crusaders, and the Blues just couldn't get into the game. The Crusaders really suffocated them, and yes, there was a short period of the game where it was about 10 to 15 minutes in the second half where you thought the Blues might be able to get back into the game. They did get a try. At that stage, it got to 16-7, and you thought, they could get back into this, back into the game here. But with the Blues scoring, the Crusaders just really switched back on and got back into their processes. They just came through and really dominated. The Crusaders could have easily had, like I said, they were held up twice over the line. Cody Taylor was taken out only centimetres away from the line, over the touchline. So they could have easily had another 3 or 4 tries, the Crusaders, and ended up winning by 30 points. But the one thing that I'll be interested to see is how this game affects the Blues going forward. We all know how the Crusaders will come back. We know that they're going to come back bigger, just as strong next year. But the Blues will be the one to watch next year, because when a team's beaten like they were in a final, the experience takes them one of two ways. They can use the experience to really grow, and the frustration of losing that final, especially at home, especially at the best ground in New Zealand, can really help them come back bigger and better next year, and they could be almost impossible to beat next year, or they could go the opposite way, where they could completely crumble and go into the shell. This loss could really destroy them. They could, and they could end up near the bottom of the table. When teams lose like they did, there doesn't tend to be much in between. They end up usually being a top 2 or 3 team, or they end up being in the bottom 4. And that's not just in Super Rugby. That's around the world. Where if a team loses gets dominated in a final, they either nearly impossible to beat, or they end up finding it impossible to win. And I really hope for their sake, and as well as the competition, because they did play really well this year. I really hope that they are strong next year, because the team needs, the competition, I should say, really needs a lot of, you think that, because as much as I'm a Crusaders fan, and I would like to see the Crusaders win, you would like to see teams challenge them, and I would rather see a competition where teams can really, where you think, which way is this game going to go? I don't know which way it's going to go. If you just turn the TV on and say, I know how this is going to go, the Crusaders or whoever are just going to blow them off the park, then it gets kind of boring watching it. So I really hope that there's the Blues, as well as a few other teams, really are really strong next year and have a possibility of beating, they really give the Crusaders a run for their money. It also would have been interesting to see a couple of households last week, as well as on the weekend, because there were actually 2 sets of brothers playing for opposite teams. Where one brother was playing for the Crusaders and the other brother was playing for the Blues. This, of course, was the Goodhue brothers, who were actually twins, Josh and Jack, and the Barrett brothers, who were Bowden and Scott, who were actually the captains of both teams. I remember a game where 2 of the Barrett brothers, I believe it was the Hurricanes and the Crusaders, either this year or last year, where Geordie, who's the third Barrett brother who plays at Super Rugby level, run it straight at Scott, and Scott absolutely smashed him. And I would have really liked to have seen that happen in this game. It didn't, but I would have loved to see them come together in this game, where one brother runs at the other. Of course, in this game it was Bowden that was in the final, because the Blues that made the final, not the Hurricanes. So Geordie wasn't in this final, but I would have liked to see them come together and put a shot on the other. Of course, lately I don't want them to do a spear tackle or a head high or something. I would just love to see them put a legitimate shot on the other one. The ball carrier just runs straight over the top of the other. I would have liked that. Would have been one thing I would have really liked to see. When I spoke to Josh and Jack's older brother Cam, he said that they did get along, but I reckon that all would have gone out the window for the game. You want to get the wood over your sibling. You would just want to, you would always want to say, you always want to one up your sibling. You always want to, compete and beat. If you're playing against them, you'd really always want to beat your sibling when you're playing against them. So I think there would have been a little bit of sibling rivalry there. But then obviously after the game, they would have all had a beer and all chatted, because of course they do get along. But unfortunately, as much as this was a great game, this might actually be the second last Super Rugby final that we see, because Rugby Australia has apparently told New Zealand Rugby that they actually want out of the competition, deciding that they would rather a domestic competition over a trans-Tasman competition. They say that with the Super Rugby AU, it brought in more money than it did when they played against New Zealand sides. So basically, when the Australian sides played against each other, that brings in more revenue. It brings in the crowds, gets bigger TV audience and all that. Then when the Australian sides play at home against the New Zealand sides. So they're saying it's more of a financial decision rather than them getting their asses whooped every week. But I think it's a bit of a, I think it is a stupid decision by Rugby Australia because of a couple of reasons. For starters, the reason why more Australians watch the game when there's two Australian sides playing against each other rather than when there's an Australian and New Zealand side play against each other. The reason why that is because they expect the game to be closer. Whereas when they play against the New Zealand sides, it's because they expect the Australian sides to get hammered. They expect the New Zealand sides to just run rampant. Not only do they expect the Australian teams to get hammered, they usually play a boring style of footy against New Zealand sides, and the quality of the games I don't think is quite there. And personally, I think I go for that with when two Australian sides play against each other. I just don't think the quality is there when it's either two Australian sides or an Australian side versus the New Zealand side. I think the standard of football is with the Australian teams is much lower than it is for the New Zealand teams. Really, I think the Rugby Australia really needs to just look at the first 10 to 15 years of Super Rugby, with the crowds in those first 10 to 15 years, because when the Australian teams were competitive against the New Zealand sides and they played a good style of footy, people expected a close game. They didn't always expect them to win, but they expected a close game and they expected an entertaining game, and therefore they wanted to watch the game whether it be on TV or at the ground. Now everyone expects one-way traffic for the New Zealand sides and the games to blow out, and no one really wants to watch a bunch of losers, which, to be brutally honest, is exactly what the Australian teams are. They are a bunch of losers, to be honest. Like that. I know that sounds rude and they sounds harsh, but they're just not winning. They haven't really been winning at Super Rugby level since the Waratahs won it in 2014. Since 2014, they really haven't been competitive against the New Zealand sides. This year is the first year where they've really been able to, where a team's been able to win multiple games against the New Zealand sides. Like I said at the start of the podcast, everyone expects, they say at the start of the year, will Australian teams win a game? Or will they be able to be competitive, let alone win a game this year? So that's what the expectation is. And until that expectation changes, people aren't going to watch it. And that's that's not a fault of New Zealand rugby. That's a fault of Rugby Australia. And because it's a boring style of footy, people don't really want to watch it. So financially, I don't think it will work long term if they do go one out and have a domestic competition, because, like I said, it is a boring style of footy. It's not an entertaining style of footy. They need to make it more entertaining, and they need to be more proactive. They need to get better players. So, this is how they will improve, and this is how they'll get the crowds back. Also, playing against better teams is how you improve, and considering how the Australian teams have been performing, both at Super Rugby level and internationally, there's a lot of improvement that needs to be done. Which comes back to the first point, losing at international level regularly, people will inevitably think that the domestic competition is substandard because, the international team is substandard. So people would subconsciously start thinking, well, the domestic competition is boring and substandard, so they'll stop watching, and as a consequence, they'll start losing even more money. A lot of people are saying, and a lot of people are actually saying that the Rugby Australia are actually just throwing the toys out of the cot, and basically, because they haven't been able to beat. The real reason is there's not a financial one, but because they have been getting beaten regularly by the New Zealand sides for a number of years now, so they're just throwing the toys out of the cot, and they're just saying, go to hell, we don't want to play you anymore. real childish mentality, because they only get the odd win here and there. They just think, oh, we don't want to play you anymore because it's too hard, instead of trying to get better. And they might think this is a bit of a payback to New Zealand rugby, because a couple of years ago, just as the pandemic started, the New Zealand rugby apparently said to the Rugby Australia that you need to have your teams really improve because your teams are just simply not up to standard. We want to have a good competition and you guys are just not at our level. So Rugby Australia just saying, okay, see you later. We don't want to play against you anymore. Sure, those are playing their, both the financial as well as, constantly losing are playing their part, but there's a little bit more behind the scenes that, isn't as well publicised, but it has made the media a bit that's playing their part as to why Rugby Australia kind of wants to go their own way. Earlier this year, Silver Lake, who is a US-based private equity firm, bought around a 7% stake in New Zealand Rugby, and they wanted to take rugby in a certain direction. However, Rugby Australia are looking at Silver Lake, who, like I said, is a private equity firm, as well as a rival private equity firm, CVC, who want to take rugby in a different direction. To make things a little bit more complicated, Rugby Australia aren't really sure they want to sell at the moment because they haven't got much money and they are frequently losing, meaning that their value has taken a bit of a nosedive. However, they're kind of stuck in a catch-22 where if they do sell, they're selling at their lowest point. However, if they don't sell now, even if it's just a small portion, they risk losing out on some much-needed extra funds from the private equity firms, which means that they could actually fall further behind the top nations to a point whereby if they don't, where they won't be able to catch up for a long time, and they risk having to sell even for even a lower value or sell more to get the same kind of cash that they would be if they were getting it now. I believe CVC have already bought stakes in other rugby governing bodies around the world, and if they buy a part of Rugby Australia, they can squeeze New Zealand rugby out and in turn get one over on Silver Lake. In many ways it's petty, obviously by the private equity firms, but you also, because, obviously, you can have differences of opinion on how rugby should be governed, but, squeezing them out just to get one over on your competition is kind of petty. And it also is a bad look because, it's basically saying, well, if we can't beat you, we're not going to play against you. And it really cheapens the competition. It really makes you look like a bunch of losers. Rather than, trying to get up to their level. Which is kind of weird because the Northern Hemisphere teams have actually got a lot better over the last number of years, and they've actually have become more competitive. Of course, Australia, the Southern Hemisphere teams have actually won more World Cups still, and it's going to take a long time for the Northern Hemisphere to catch up to the Southern Hemisphere, but there's a real chance that France could actually win the next World Cup, which would really shake things up and really make the Southern Hemisphere teams really wake up and properly focus on their sport, on the grassroots, I should say. Whatever direction Rugby Australia decides to take, they need a complete revamp. They need to completely change the direction that they're going. I remember watching a Waratahs game earlier this year, and Tim Horan said on commentary that he didn't agree with people that said the money should go towards grassroots, but instead it should go towards the top players. So the best players stay in Australia, and they want to play rugby. They want to play rugby union instead of going playing in an overseas competition or playing rugby league, suggesting that the Australian teams would be more competitive, which would result in more kids wanting to play rugby union, and then the numbers would increase, and that is how they can compete over rugby league and AFL. When I heard this, I was like, have you lived with your, with your blindfolds on or something since 2000? Like, have you not been paying attention? Because that's exactly what Union has done since 2000. Buying players from rugby league on bigger, when they could afford to put them on bigger money, especially, and they did this simply because since 2000, because they wanted to win the 2003 World Cup. They bought players like Lottie DeCurie, Wendell Saylor, Matt Rogers, these kind of guys from rugby league for the 2003 World Cup. And about 10 years ago, the money started running out, as there was no money being spent at the juniors, and no juniors were coming through, no quality juniors were coming through. And as time was rolling on, rugby league was able to start paying their players better, and therefore they'll it came a time where they were paying their players the same, and now they're actually paying more. So there was no incentive to switch codes for those rugby league players, because the only reason why they would switch is because of money. And now that they're not able to pay extra money, there's no incentive for those guys to switch over. Then Rugby Australia thought the solution to this is, instead of going to rugby league, they'll go to the Pacific Islands and poach the best players from the Pacific and have them play for Australia. This has also run into many problems as well, because New Zealand and many of the other European teams also poach many of the best Pacific players to play for their nation. So, Australia can get, can poach so many. And the other thing is, the Pacific nations are only small nations. How many players do you expect to get from those nations? Because also some of those players also want to play for their own nation. So you're only going to get so many players who switch over from those nations. It's brought some quality players over, such as Marika Korobidi and Sami Karevi, but this also won't work in the long term, simply because they're like I said, they're only small nations and they can only produce so many players. So the strategy is build from within. They should invest in the juniors, get as many people playing rugby as possible, give them the best resources, and just throw the money at them, and then you will see that money will come back, as those kids will start going to Super Rugby games as well as Shoot Shield games, and if they're going, the parents will go. They will start buying merchandise, and then their friends, and then their friends want to start getting involved as well. That's basically what happened when I was a kid in primary school. Nearly all the boys in my year played rugby union at the same club, and if the union does it, if the union does a similar kind of thing, where they get all the a certain percentage of the boys, they will get all the, and they'll also get it with the same with the girls. If the girls, they want the girls to come in, go to the women's game. That's how they do it. You need to start at the grassroots. They need to, instead of trying to get short-term results, they need to think long-term and take the short-term hits. This is what Penrith did in the NRL. they were broke, just like Rugby Australia. They're on the verge of bankruptcy. And then they brought Gus Gordon. He came in. He knew James Packer. Asked for basically if James Packer didn't give him a loan, Penrith were basically going to fold. They were literally because no bank would lend to them. They were that bad that no lender was going to give them money. It was basically James Packer or they were going broke, and Phil Good came in, completely revamped the place, basically chucked everything, like scrapped everything that they were doing and completely revamped it and started up a plan for long-term growth. He completely restructured the how the league's club was run. He restructured the juniors. He restructured absolutely everything. And yes, it took a lot longer than what they expected. They thought it was going to take about 5 years to get everything in order and eventually win a premiership. Whereas, he was there. He ended up being there, I believe, for 9 years. But when he started, they were both terrible, both on the field and off the field, and they looked gone. But now, as time went on, they started winning more and more games, and now they've won a premiership, with a squad where vast majority of the players came through their pathways, whether it be within the Penrith catchment or whether it was in regional areas, and now they're also financially stable. This is a system that rugby union should follow. Sure, rugby union doesn't have a leagues club, but they can get a leagues club, or they can get something that they can set up where they can make money, and provided they do it the right way, they will see success. One thing that they also need to do is create a proper system for players 18 to 22. While I do love club rugby, I think there needs to be something in between club rugby and Super Rugby, so that these kids can get proper growth. In South Africa, they have the Currie Cup. In New Zealand, they have the NPC. In rugby league, they have reserve grade as well as a few other development systems. Australia used to have the NRC, but the problem was that they never promoted it correctly. So people didn't know the teams. They didn't know when the games were on. They didn't know who was playing. They didn't know the players. So there was no attachment. They didn't promote it properly. They promoted it properly. They had the right idea, but they didn't promote it properly. They promoted it properly. That would have been the perfect opportunity for players to really grow. And I think this would have been a good stepping stone for players who aren't quite ready for Super Rugby as well, but are still solid players. And they can use it as a way to grow them into that competition. But they also have, but it's also a competition for current Super Rugby players who aren't in the national team. So if there's ever a injury at the international level, they can just step up from that NRC or whatever you like to call it, or competition that you like to call it, and there isn't that big step because they're still playing against Super Rugby quality players, similar to what happens in the Currie Cup and the NPC, because there isn't that huge gap jump from club footy to international international level, and players are still around the professional environment and they can remain fit. So that's what I believe that should happen with Rugby Australia, and that was my summary of the Super Rugby season, as well as what I think Rugby Australia should do going forward. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about both the Super Rugby season, the final, as well as the what where the direction that Rugby Australia should take, whether you think that they should go in a domestic competition, or whether you think that they should play a domestic competition. Personally, I think the domestic competition should be left to the NPC, but they should stay in the Super Rugby. That's my personal opinion, but I'm always interested to hear different opinions. And yeah, until next time, thanks for listening.